terrorists. If we're going to address the challenge of their efforts to recruit,
it is vital that we win the propaganda war.
Make no mistake, this was a terrorist attack.
Welcome to Extreme Calls, the podcast where you learn about extremist communications and propaganda. My name is Stefan Bale from the University of Exeter, and today we look at the expanding far-right online environment, and more specifically to the so-called chans. In 1999, a Japanese forum named 2channel appears on the internet, and less than 2 years later, an almost identical chat room called Futaba Channel was launched. While originally dedicated to video games, manga, and anime movies, and random discussions more broadly, these sites quickly channeled nationalistic rants, pornography, and hate speech. The multiplication of discussion websites using the very same structure, like 4chan in 2003, triggered a flow of controversies related to xenophobia, conspiracy theories, misogyny, child pornography, harassment, and violence. One of the most infamous chat rooms, the now defunct 8chan, was directly linked to a series of far-right inspired acts of violence, including Brenton Tarrant's Christchurch attack or Patrick Crusius' shooting of the El Paso Walmart. Worryingly, rather than disappearing following these tragic events, the chans now seem to mushroom, participating in the general expansion of the broader far-right online ecosystem. And this is why we dedicate this Extreme Calls to it.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and incite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet.
To ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility.
And to do so, we are here with Dr. Lewys Brace. Lewis, welcome to Extreme Calls. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thrilled. Lewis, just for our listeners, you are a lecturer in data science at the University of Exeter, and you have been part of a series of projects investigating the far-right internet, right? Especially the so-called chans, and we're going to talk about this, of course, today. Amongst your papers that study these online subcultures and communities, I may point out one specifically called Uncovering the Far-Right Online Ecosystem. Why? Because I think it's the one that is the most closely related to what we're going to talk about today. And I would like to start with a question that is probably directly linked to that paper. It's a very general question to really sort of set the stage for today's discussion. What is exactly this far-right online ecosystem that you have uncovered in this paper? So, what are we talking about when we think about right-wing extremists online?
Yeah. Okay. So the term far-right online ecosystem is sort of an umbrella term, right? That we use to discuss online platforms and so on that host far-right content, or more accurately, I should say, what we perceive to be far-right content. Okay, so one of the issues we've been having is finding specific metrics you can use to quantify certain bits of content as being far-right in nature, right? So there are certain things you might see on a website and think, oh, okay, that's far-right, but it might not be so. And Unfortunately, one of the best examples I can give is jokes about Jewish people, anti-Semitic humour, and I want to emphasise the quote marks there, right? You might look at a website and see these anti-Semitic jokes and say, well, that's clearly an example of far-right behaviour. But unfortunately, there are large parts of the internet where you can go and see these kind of jokes being made quite freely. And these are parts of the websites that have nothing to do with the far right at all. So unfortunately, there's no one specific metric. As such, you kind of, from your time immersed in these websites and sort of analysing them and researching them, you tend to develop a strong sense of I know it when I see an approach. Although going forward, I am trying to develop a more coherent metric we can use. But if we put that sort of debate to one side for a moment, then the term far right online ecosystem is a term we use to refer to the entirety of the online presence of the far right. And this ranges from what we would call traditional Web 1.0 style websites, through to websites that host blogs, boards such as the Chans, which we'll discuss later, YouTube videos, right through to Twitter accounts, Gab accounts, and up until a couple of days ago, Parler accounts and so on. In regards to the size of the far right ecosystem, I'm afraid I can't give you a definitive answer there. For my personal work and the work we've been doing at Exeter, I feel as though it feels infinite. I know it's not, but it feels that way. And the reason I say that is because the more platforms we find, the more that tends to lead us to. Okay. Now, this might sound a bit sort of doom and gloom with me saying there's, almost seemingly infinite amount of far right websites out there. But I think there are two very important things to note here. Okay. Firstly, not all of these platforms or accounts are always active. Okay. The far right online ecosystem isn't a static phenomenon. Okay. It's a little bit like a biological species, and that it's constantly evolving and changing in accordance with various selection pressures. It's just that here, these selection pressures, they tend to take the form of things such as website closures, perhaps the need on the part of the user base to be anonymous, factors such as those. Indeed, when we sort of get onto our discussion of the Chans in a bit, we'll no doubt discuss the sort of various user migrations and the times we've sort of seen the community adapt a bit. The second point I think is worth noting here, and I have no actual data to support this hypothesis yet. It's more of a sort of working notion that I've developed from my time looking at this kind of content, is that I believe this ecosystem is characterized by, yes, a large number of sites, but a large number of sites and resources with very little traffic. I feel as though there's going to be a small number of sites where there's a large user base, and then sort of like all these little offshoots. And indeed, we've seen this work we've done on the Chans, which we'll no doubt, again, discuss in a minute. But I feel as though that's the best way to sort of characterize the online, sort of the far right online ecosystem, right? Is that it's all these digital platforms taking different forms, different parts of this ecosystem perhaps ascribe to different parts of the far right ideology. But yeah, there'll be small number of platforms, accounts, websites, whatever, with a large user base, and then loads of like a little quiet, loads of no to perhaps a few users. It's relatively low traffic, basically.
Right, and so a huge variety of types of websites.
Oh yeah, yes. Yeah, you've got websites that range from clearly a website. If you just look at the Web 1.0 style websites, for example, you have sites that were clearly developed by one guy sat at home, right through to sites that they're very professional and sort of slick in nature, and they look like they belong to some fancy sort of metropolitan style startup. And also it's important to note, and I don't think I really mentioned this, just this sheer multimedia style aspect of the ecosystem as well, right? These aren't just websites and blog posts, it's YouTube, it's Twitter, it's constantly there, constantly being broadcast to people. And we've seen this, well, it seems topical to talk about it, given that we're recording this on, what, the 11th of January? We saw this with the QAnon conspiracy theory, which has arguably led to, well, one of the factors at least that contributed to the Capitol building storming the other day. QAnon, that sort of conspiracy theory, actually started off on the chans and it's since spread out and is now popular on YouTube, Twitter, and it's sort of, for lack of a better term, it's gone mainstream.
Yeah, you do find some ideas or sort of claims about that kind of conspiracy that have, in fact, sort of permeated to the more mainstream or sort of alt-right media. Even if they are a little bit transformed or toned down, you do still find this. So, for example, this idea that the country is ruled by a pedophile clique, right?
Oh, a satanic pedophile.
Or satanic pedophile clique. Yeah, but what I mean is that then you find on, you know, alt-right, more mainstream media, you do find this sort of accusation of you know, that the Democrats are pedophiles or things like that. So indeed, and so what I find it interesting listening to do is this idea that, so these three ideas that I take from what you've just said is that it's huge, it's really big. You have like what, it's in the thousands of, you know, 10,000s of websites, or, you know, it's certainly not in the hundreds or in the dozens. It's huge, but nonetheless, they're not all active or popular. It's more like some of them really attract many users, while some others, you know, remain on the fringe. Maybe they have a few visitors and then they're off, that kind of thing. But also what I take is the idea that you do have several within this ecosystem, you have several communities or networks that reflect the different, I think you said, ideologies of the far right or something like that, or milieus or nuances or something. So you do have, it's not like a coherent, it's not like, let's say, the Islamic State online presence where they sort of try to canvas and give a coherent message across all the platforms. Here it's more like a little bit heterogeneous, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's reflective of the two sort of movements, if you will, their sort of approaches to it. Okay, so with IS, we very much had the media central, right? I know they exported their content abroad and had sort of locals at the country sort of tailor it towards their specific geographic audience, but they did have a sort of quote unquote media center, if you will.
Absolutely.
Whereas with the far right, there is some coordination at levels, but there's not that overarching coordination. And I think this is reflective in the way that the far right ideology, sort of what we call the far right ideology, I think can best be conceptualized as a sort of spectrum. Okay, and you've got, and here, and we talk about this in one of our papers actually, where we sort of lay out a research agenda for research in the far right. You kind of have some overlapping ideas. So, for example, you might have the you might sort of have like the alt-right movement sort of here, and that overlaps with some of the other stuff. And then you might have your militia movement sort of over here, and that might overlap with certain aspects of the ideology. And then you might have the incel stuff right on the end here. So they sort of pick ideas and sort of narratives from one another, and there is a sort of blanket sort of far right umbrella to it, but it's not one coherent solid ideology, right? It's a sort of hodgepodge, and it's very much reflective of the way in which it's a sort of notion and ideology is built from the sort of bottom up, compared to sort of ISIS's approach of these are going to be the kind of narratives we want to say, these are our crisis solution narratives that we want to put out there.
Right, and then here we have a multiplicity of different groups or individuals who try to promote and disseminate their own message, their own flavor to the public. And so we end up with, as you say, a hodgepodge, a sort of heterogeneous, huge amount of websites and social media accounts and stuff like that. And in that spectrum, you mentioned different communities or sort of ideologies, and I would like to now dig deeper on this community or subculture of the chans, which first, very broadly, because the chance is not by definition something which is far right or extreme sort of neo-Nazi. So why should we pay attention? So very first, before we actually dig into the more far right components of the chance, what exactly, for the people who have no idea about what these chans are, what are they?
Okay, so yeah, the chans is a sort of colloquial term that we came up with to refer to a family of websites that include 4chan, 8chan, which was shut down last year and is now known as 8kun, Infinity Chan, Space Chan, N-Chan, 9chan, and so on. There's a whole host of these websites, all of which end in chan, hence where we've got the name N-Chan. All of these sites tend to follow the same sort. They're of the same. They're clearly of the same family, right? They all use the same basic HTML template. And
so they look alike, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
They look alike, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, they look
they all have
exactly
different
alike.
names.
Yeah, they all look exactly alike. They follow this, they're literally the same website architecture.
Okay.
And they are all anonymous image boards. So what that means is that all of the posts are anonymous. So like, you don't sign up for a user account, you don't have a user handle. They're all anonymous.
Right.
And then they're image boards. And what that means is that each post made to the to a specific board within a chan will contain both text but also images.
All right.
And the images are what we found with the chans. The images are equally as important as the text. And in many cases, most of the information content of a post can be found in the image. And this is where we start to see the well-documented overlap with sort of far right and their use of memes. These memes are very prominent on the websites.
Yeah, we'll get that on these memes and that kind of visual culture in a little bit. But so overall, the chance. So there are discussion forums, yeah.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned boards. So
yes. So
thematic boards, yeah.
Yeah, each chan has a series of boards to it, and each of these boards are dedicated to specific discussions, and it's within these boards that the users make posts. So
Okay.
on 4chan, for example, you will have boards that are dedicated to things such as cooking, video games, movies, books, whatever. The reason we're studying the chans from our perspective of studying the far right is because they also contain other boards with far right content on it, which I think we're going to get onto in some depth.
Yeah, absolutely. So these boards are important. So before getting to explicitly these far right boards, you mentioned that the chans talk about cooking or books or video games. Why? Okay, there might be some far right discussions, but is that it, or is there something else with the chance that some red flags, some problems that because it seems like when we hear about the chance, it's usually not in a very good way.
Yeah, and I think the chans are websites that have clearly, like you said, when you hear about them, you only ever hear about them in a sort of negative context. Okay, and I think when 4chan itself was set up, I believe it was originally set up with the best of intentions, and it was the idea of this web community and so on. Like, it was set up a little bit before I was in this field studying websites, but I generally do believe it was set up with the best of intentions. 8chan, however, and what we now call 8kun, I think it's a very different story. Okay, so if you allow me,
yeah, sure.
If you look at the history of 8chan, so 4chan existed and had all these boards. Okay, and then in the summer of 2014, we saw an online sort of argument break out known as #Gamergate. And this was where, don't get me wrong, sort of racist slurs and misogyny have been prevalent on 4chan for a while. But during this #Gamergate controversy, the sort of misogynistic tendencies of some of these boards really came to the forefront. As a result of that, the 4chan moderators started to moderate discussions on the subject, and before ultimately banning discussion of the subject altogether. Now, one of the defining characteristics of these chans is that it's supposed to be a place where people can discuss what they want freely, and which is why they pride themselves upon the anonymous nature of the forum. It's this idea to be anonymous is one of their defining features. So once 4chan had banned discussions on this, 8chan had already been set up but hadn't yet defined a user base. And the guy who set up 8chan, Frederick Brennan, who I should now say has since separated himself from the site altogether, when he set this up, he presented it as a quote-unquote no holds barred equivalent of 4chan. And once you combine this anonymous nature of the sites with this promise of absolutely no moderation whatsoever, it sort of just essentially pulled the worst aspects of 4chan straight to it.
Okay.
So I think 4chan, yeah, originally set up with this idea of being a community, but once you get to 8chan, that was, if you're presenting something as a no holds barred equivalent following a controversy like that, there's perhaps maybe not a conscious intent, but you're going to attract the worst parts of that site, right?
Right.
And so I think, yeah, and we'll talk about this in a little bit when we sort of talk about research where we've characterized the different chans into a hierarchy.
Right.
But you do see this, you do see this
yeah, but
sort of issue.
We can get straight to that. I mean, I think let's jump in on this. So what you're saying is that basically not all the chans are equal or not as equally problematic. So 4chan might have a series of, sort of not very nice forums. There has been some kind of effort to be a bit more careful and to moderate, but still you do have some problematic discussions. But you do have some chance that almost by design host the worst of the worst. And so we might have some different levels of how problematic they are. And it seems, hearing you, that some chance by design or through some some events out there, their raison d'être was to attract more political or racist or misogynistic discussions. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in our research, we've characterized the chans into a sort of 3-tier hierarchy. Okay. And so on level 1 of this hierarchy, if you will, we've got 4chan. Okay. So 4chan has these different boards, movies, video games, whatever, as well as the sort of poll boards, the K boards, which are dedicated to discussions and ammunition, and it's got a QAnon related board as well.
Okay.
But if you look at, so the poll board stands for politically incorrect, and no doubt we'll discuss that in a second in depth, because that's probably the main focus of most of the analysis on these boards. But if you look at the discussions there's racist slurs, there's anti-Semitic sentiment, and on this politically incorrect board on 4chan, there's clearly some far-right stuff there. But then if you go to tier 2, there's sort of the sort of extremeness of the content sort of increases a bit. And you also have a narrowing of the different types of boards as well. Not that much, but noticeably less than sort of 4chan. And
so that is what, 8kun?
That'll be 8kun.
That was 8chan, or now 8kun. Okay.
Yeah, so 8chan did sort of hold this place, but in August 2009, following its links with a number of different far-right shootings, it was shut down after the El Paso Walmart shooting. Right. And then 8kun after that happened, we saw a diversification. We saw a whole bunch of chans emerge relatively quickly. But
Okay.
Aitken is quote unquote the direct successor.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do have these different chants, and if you want, there are some 3 tiers, and we go down to the more and more extreme, and the scope of the discussion that are not far right or problematic or racist diminishes as you go down. And
yeah, but not just for discussions, but the different types of boards as well.
yeah, that's what I meant. So sort of you don't find discussions on books or recipes if you go down to the most extreme ones, I guess.
No,
or not the kind of books that are
not the kind of books you want to be caught holding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and so right, it seems like all the discussion is now sort of ends on these so-called poll boards, right? So the boards that really focus on so-called politically incorrect themes or topics. This is where we find the racist slurs. Yeah, this is the home of the sort of really far right. Is that, what kind of far right is this? Like neo-Nazi more, or is this the kind of counter-jihad Islamophobic? What kind of far right is this, or do you have different flavors and different chants?
Again, it depends on which level of the hierarchy of the chan you're on.
Okay.
So on 4chan, if you go to their poll, their politically incorrect board, I would characterize that as being more sort of similar with the alt-right. Okay, so it's this idea of trolling, deliberately producing a large amount of what they like to call shit posting, which is this idea that you generate a large amount of low quality content with the specific aim to try and outrage people.
Okay.
And you see that kind of mentality. And then you see it a bit more in 8chan, 8kun. But, it's in the middle for a reason, right? Then when you go on to the tier 3 versions of the chans, we've got N-chan and 9chan and so on. The discussions are noticeably different there, okay? So they're doing things like comparing the manifestos of different shooters. You can best describe that content as outright neo-Nazi.
Okay.
They even have a version of the poll board called /fascist. And the fascist boards, I like the poll boards, but just the Nazis and just turned up. It's the best way to sort of describe them.
Right, and so, but reassure me, these are less popular, taking us back to your previous claim that not everything is as popular. You have many different websites, but they're not all popular, and some are just so much on the fringe. These are less attended. That, so 4chan is a huge website, right? Drawing loads and loads of people, but I guess as you go down, you have less and less people. Yeah,
so definitely. So we did some work where we looked at the traffic and measured by the number of posts. And we found 4chan, for example, had an average of 92 posts per day last summer.
But on the poll board,
Specifically on the poll board, yeah. 8kun had an average of about 10. 16chan had about 1, maybe 2. And then N-chan, 9chan, you were looking at 1 every 3 days, if that.
So these are hardly discussion boards because it's not very well attended.
No, but in terms of content, you do see like I said, you start to see this noticeable shift from shit posting to what they call effort posting, where they have like these long posts that are sort of
more ideological.
Yeah, they're ideological, backed up by research, quote unquote research, and yeah.
Excellent. And so so there's, when you think about these chants, so I think we got the picture of these chant boards, some of them very big, not very, very popular, some of them more on the fringe, different thematic boards, some of them being very focused on some far-right discussions. You talked earlier about the fact that in these forums, images are very important. People are expected to post an image together with text or just an image. So can you tell us a little bit about what kind of images you find on these politically incorrect boards?
Yeah. Predominantly, you find what we call memes. Okay, and for anyone not familiar with this, a meme can be an image that takes on a specific meaning in a specific context. Okay, and it can be anything. So we see memes being made out of like old 60s cartoons, out of video game screenshots, in general, snippets from like a movie, like the screens, the shots from a movie. You can make a sort of meme out of anything, really. But on these poll boards, we get some of that, but we also see that they also have their own specific memes. When you talk about memes in the far right, everyone thinks of Pepe the Frog. That's perhaps the most popular one, well, the most frequent one you see, and therefore the most well-known one. But you have a load of others from sort of memes that make up caricatures of various ethnic groups. Some that are sort of they each have specific meanings. Okay, so some of them are based on racist stereotypes. Some of them are meant to show that you need compassion or so on. Some are outright sort of designed to show irony, as is the case with Pepe the Frog. And what we see is interesting in the far right as well is that often they'll take, and I'm sure this is the same in other online communities as well, they'll often take well-established memes and give it its own little twist. So they'll alter the meaning of it in its own way. Also, alongside that, you also see a lot of Nazi iconography and so on. And because the politically incorrect boards are predominantly supposed to be a place where people can discuss things like politics and social issues without the constraints of political correctness. Again, I want to emphasize the speech marks here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, these are concepts.
And because of that, you often see a lot of image of political figures. So you see a lot of like Donald Trump and so on.
Right.
You see a lot of pictures of famous Democrats, so Hillary Clinton and so on. Never in a flattering light. So yeah, you see a lot of political figures. See stuff in the news that you often see in the news, as well as these sort of cartoon memes, which are supposed to be sort of mocked jokingly and so on.
And so there's a lot of images, like, I mean, typically memes, it's supposedly very often, I mean, not always, but it's supposedly humoristic, right? It's supposedly for fun or as a joke, but I think that, I mean, sometimes you hear this argument kind of defending these places like, it's just to have fun. It's not serious. It's just to offend people. And, people get angry and because they're offended so easily nowadays. Okay. So, but I mean, okay, I can take that argument, but it doesn't take away the fact that there have been, I mean, it's not just an online subculture that makes fun of things. You do have some real world sort of developments or events that are quite tragic and that have been linked directly to some of these chants. Can you tell us a little bit more about these events that kind of actually show that, no, it's not just a community where people have fun. It's something much, I mean, it's something much more serious.
Yeah, and I'd argue much more insidious as well in certain cases. So perhaps let's start with the incident that really brought these poll boards to the public attention, okay? And that's the Christchurch shooting, okay? We know the individual responsible for that spent a large amount of time on 8chan. We know he was an active user and an active member. And although the image boards are anonymous, we know he was an active member for two reasons. Okay, firstly, if you look at his manifesto, it is covered with Chan-style humor and specifically Chan-style in-jokes. So they're paragraph, and not just in terms of images, but in terms of what I call linguistic memes as well. And this is how I refer to chunks of text which they treat like memes. Okay, they're using different contexts, and there's a large amount to this manifesto that if you read as an outsider who hasn't ever been to these websites, they just sound like crazed ramblings. They're nonsensical, right? But as someone who's researched these websites, I recognise a large amount of these texts, and they were clearly in jokes. That manifesto wasn't produced for what the Chans call normies, i.e. people who don't use these sites. It was specifically designed to appeal to that user base, to recognize them. The second reason we know this is because this was the first major time we saw an MO that unfortunately would repeat itself numerous times, and that's that.
A modus operandi, you mean MO? Yeah.
Oh yes,
Okay.
yes, a modus operandi. Sorry. That's that before the perpetrator committed his attack, he made a post to 8chan, and this post, again, it's full of clearly in-group style language, sort of friendly language, and it also included links to his manifesto and to a Facebook live stream of his attack.
Right, so that's the kind of infamous video that the shooter, so Brenton Tarrant, took with the webcam that was on his helmet or something like that. And so, so he posts that on the forum and together with his manifesto and a series of in-jokes.
Yeah, and even on the rifles he was using himself, you can see 8chan in-jokes written on there as well. So he was clearly an active member. Okay. Right. Whether or not that was the sole source of what converted him from online behaviours to real world action, I'm not in a position to say, but we know that the 8chan at least contributed to that journey from online behaviour to off-world action.
Right. And
we've seen this same behaviour happen a couple of times since then with the Poway synagogue shooter and the El Paso Walmart shooter. Both of these individuals, before committing their attacks, made a post to 8chan announcing their attacks, announcing what they were going to do, again using in-group terminology. And if you look at their manifestos, not only do they make these in-joke references again, but they specifically mention the Christchurch shooter by name and specifically mention him as an influencing factor.
Okay.
So, yeah, I know there was for a while some discussion about whether or not online behaviour can translate itself into offline real world action. I think we're past the point of sort of that being a theoretical now, and I'd happily say with some certainty that in some cases this does happen. People do go from online behaviour to off-world action, and that's why I think people see the poll boards as problematic. Although they have these boards dedicated to other discussions, the bad outweighs the good in many cases.
Yeah, and then I mean it's not only that. You do have people who are going to take up these ideas and go on with their own shooting. It's also that, and it seems to me like it's a similar kind of dynamic, which is a sort of vicious circle that you find in other sorts of online subcultures. So we've discussed the incel subculture in an earlier session, and I mean, you do have people who have been inspired by, so let's say just like here, people have been inspired by Brenton Tarrant. They go on to kill people in the street. It's the same in the incel kind of subculture. Some people have been inspired by Elliot Rodger and they go on, so like typically Alec Minashian driving his van in Toronto and killing people, proclaiming that he has been inspired by Elliot Rodger. But then what seems to be the case that it's not just from online to offline. Then Alec Minashian becomes another person on these online spaces that becomes some kind of celebrity or someone that who's admired. And it seems here that it's the same kind of stuff with the 8chan or 8kun or all these chants. people are inspired by the Chan, but then they become an inspiration for further Chan discussion and for further shooters. And so it's kind of online, offline, with some shooters or killers, terrorists gaining some kind of celebrity status or that kind of, and so it further pushes people because they know that they might become such sort of glorified figures.
Yeah, definitely. I think it also partly links into the whole idea in the terrorism studies literature of this whole idea of terrorism contagion, right? Where you start to see mimics of attacks.
Right.
Someone does something one way, and we saw this unfortunately in Europe a couple of summers ago, right, with ban and knife attacks. One person does it, successful, people mimic that behaviour. And I think that's definitely what we saw in the Brenton Tower case and the subsequent shooters after that.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, and it's not just in sort of politically. I mean, it's not just on these political communities, because I think it taps on a sort of a much more sort of, I don't know how to qualify this, but another type of more not political behavior, but more natural behavior, or I don't know how to call this, but because you see that also in crimes that are not political. So I did spend some time looking at a series of online forums, and sort of small, but nonetheless, there are some discussions quite, that are going on all the time that are dedicated to school shootings, in America. And here it seems like, again, you have a community that is discussing, the Columbine school shooting, and then they did it like that, and then it inspires people to do more school shootings. And so it's not just a political, it's like some kind of becoming a celebrity in a niche online subculture.
Yeah, and you definitely see it. Like you mentioned the incels, and they have titles they bestow upon characters like Elliot Rodger and Alec Manassian, and we see the same titles being bestowed upon the Christchurch shooter and so on in the Chans. It's the same terminology, so there is definitely that. But going back to your other point about it not just being political, I think that links into another reason as to perhaps why these Chans constitute such a sort of concerning, radicalizing milieu in their own right. And that's the fact that they make these kind of behaviors fun, right? They lure people in with their irony, their self-deprecating humor. In both the far right and the incel terminology, we see the concept of redpilling, which is the idea of coming. It's an idea borrowed from the Matrix films. It's the idea about being woken up to how the world really is. And I always remember seeing a post made to one of the Chans and reading the post, and they were talking about the concept of redpilling, and they were pretty much saying, well, redpilling happens by accident. You don't realize it's happening. You start logging onto these Chans and you start talking to people, and slowly, without even realizing it, you start to see how the world really is. And I remember reading that and thinking back to theories of radicalization and thinking about how, that's exactly what happens. Like, you sort of target people, you start giving them various narratives, you give them crisis solution narratives, and over a period of time, they start to slowly come around to your way of thinking. And you see that in the Chans through, but they, and again, I want to emphasize speech marks, but they make it fun, right, with their memes and their in-jokes and their irony. They present it in a jovial manner. And that's why I think one of the characteristics we've seen on the Chans from our research is a directional relationship. So if we look at Chans which reference posts from other Chans, okay, you'll see Aitken reference posts from 4chan. You'll also see the Chans in tier 3, so N-chan, 9chan, and so on, reference posts in 8chan and 4chan. But you'll never see it the other way around. You'll never see 4chan reference posts from the higher tiers. And there could be reasons for this, such as some of the higher tiers are only appearing on the dark web and so on, or perhaps people don't abide by that ideology. But to me, this sort of shows a sort of a journey, if you will, of maybe you go onto 4chan or get looped into And again, my inner data scientist hates me saying this because I have no data to support this. This is me talking to someone who spent time on the websites and has studied extremism for a bit. But I could easily see a scenario where someone goes onto 4chan, buys into the humor, the self-deprecating jokes and so on, and so slowly moves on up the tiers a little bit and sort of starts absorbing more and more extreme content as they start to absorb more and more content. And what's interesting to me is that this isn't really anything new, right? If you take a step back and look at these chans, you see the same things we see here. You mentioned ISIS propaganda earlier. You see the same, and it's the same here. You see the same kind of things you see in all sort of extremist propaganda. You see clearly defined in-groups, out-groups, crisis solution narratives, and you see the same stuff there. And yeah, and I can, yeah, going back to your point about it not being political, I think that's the problem with the chans, is that they make this kind of thinking fun and accessible, and you don't need to go far to find it. Right, it's just there. You can, any time of the day, like on your lunch break, you can just look it up, and I think that's the power of it.
Okay, and I mean, there's so much to talk about all these dynamics, but time is running out, and so but I still have, I think, one important question and then a less important one. The important question is again, time-wise, we have to wrap this up quite quickly. So if you have a brief answer to this question, which is an important one though. So it's a problematic online space, and so I mean, I know very well that governments, especially in the US and the UK and Canada, are taking it very seriously, but they are struggling to address this phenomenon and to build, you know, proper counter-extremist policies and actions. What are the main problems that governments face when they try to tackle this problem, this online space? If you have to summarize and list kind of quickly.
Yeah. So specifically in regards to the chans, they face they face the same problem as they face when they try to shut down pirating websites like the Pirate Bay, in that it's what I call a Hydra effect. You cut down one, two more websites take its place. And like I said earlier, we saw this immediately as soon as 8chan was shut down, right? All these websites use the same HTML template, like I said earlier. So they can set up new versions of these sites quicker than the governments can shut them down. The problem they have is attracting that new user base. And that's why it takes a while, and that's why some of them aren't popular.
So there's still a cost. I mean, it's a Hydra effect, but if you proceed quickly, you can kind of, and relentlessly, it can be kind of an effective tool, I guess.
Yeah, but I think you should, at some point, do a nuanced approach as well. Instead of like trying to remove them all, perhaps try and get rid of the more problematic ones.
Right.
If I had to sum up the chans issue in regards to far-right extremism, I would say to get their gateways to more extreme content. So I would perhaps look at them in relation to what they're linking to, and perhaps take a more nuanced approach in regards to what you're shutting down, with that sort of taking that into effect.
Trying to shut down the ones in which users post links to more problematic content online, to shut down those that are the most obviously Nazi in their ideology and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you clearly see this, right? Like, we did some work looking at which external sites are linked to by each of the different chans. And 4chan, you see a large amount of news websites being linked to, and YouTube and so on.
Right.
8chan, you start to see a couple more far-right websites creep in there, but then on the tier 3, they're linking to just straight up document resources for things like Mein Kampf and so on, and as the most obvious example, but also a load of other problematic content. So I would prioritize sort of perhaps removing that content and, you know, using perhaps the tier 2 ones to isolate and notice those.
Right. Okay. And I've got one final question, which is less important than the policy one, but nonetheless would like to hear about that. It's the same two questions that I ask everyone I interview in this series. So there are two questions, very briefly. So the first one is about your research. So you've explored the chance. Are you still doing it? Why? And what's your future or ongoing research? Can you tell us, like in a couple of sentences, what you're studying and why it's important? And also, I mean, I know about it because we work together actually on this one, but our audience does not. And then also, I asked the same question to everyone again. What would be the one book on extremism, terrorism, that you would recommend to our listeners?
Okay, so let's start with current and future research. Well, I guess do a shameless self-plug. We're currently starting the new North Face funded project called XIDs, which is obviously in collaboration with Copenhagen and Trinity College Dublin. XIDs itself stands for Extreme Identities, and this project aims to combine and provide an analysis of the European far-right online ecosystem. Okay, so looking at not just the Chans, but the broader far-right ecosystem, specifically in the European context. And as we did with the Chans work, we're going to combine various computational methods along with in-depth sort of qualitative work in order to hopefully yield some kind of understanding of the evolution of the European far-right ecosystems. The project now has a nice new Twitter account, which you can find at EXID_project, where you'll get, if you follow that, you'll get all our nice project updates. Or if you follow me on Twitter, you'll get the same information, but perhaps with a really terrible joke alongside. So whichever one's your flavor.
Not the kind of 8chan jokes, I hope.
Oh, no. This is, I've seen enough of those jokes for a lifetime.
Okay, and the book?
The book, I'd have to say Extremism by J.M. Berger.
Okay.
It's a nice, lovely introductory book. It's sub 200 pages, but it gets right to the heart of explaining many of the things we've discussed here in regards to how in-group, out-groups work, how crisis solution narratives work. And it doesn't talk about it in relation to any one type of ideology, but gives an overview of those dynamics itself. And so it's a nice little introductory book.
Excellent. And on that, I will have to thank you for taking part in this call. Actually, there's another session on this Extreme Calls podcast that focuses on the far-right internet, but on another part of it, which is the counter-jihad sort of nebula with Ben Lee. But I think so the two talks are really just sort of nicely combined with each other. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to answer my questions, and hopefully you had a good time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Take care.
There are platforms to share now hateful, racist language and cite to violence through social media.
Pour lutter contre le terrorisme et les discours de haine sur Internet,
to ensure that such events never occur again. Preventing genocide and other monstrous crimes is a shared responsibility